Hey everyone, I recently had the opportunity to run an introductory workshop to lighting in Unreal Engine for LTU, or Lawrence Technical University. This workshop was completely free for all participants and was funded by the Epic Mega Grants through LTU, and it was run fully remotely through Discord. This is a 4-part video series that captures the entire workshop. Each video or module will cover a different aspect of lighting in Unreal Engine. Module 1 is an overview of the Unreal Engine UI. Module 2 covers the lighting workflow for exteriors. Module 3 covers lighting interiors. And Module 4 covers light baking with Lightmass and post-processing settings. If you found this video helpful, let me know in the comments below and I'll be happy to share more Unreal Engine content on my YouTube channel. So with that, enjoy. Alright, so now we're getting to the point where we have our exterior lit, we have our interior lit, and we want to start finalizing some things. So that's where taking a look at our Lightmass settings are going to help. Alright, now it's more than just going to build light quality and then doing production. You'll definitely get better than what we see here in preview, but we want to kind of help guide Lightmass to where to focus its efforts on. All right, so I'm gonna just do some last bit of cleaning here, drop my Lightmass portal there and then grab my reflections, put them in the reflection group, and Lightmass importance goes into lighting, all of our interior reflections. All right, so everything's kind of nice and clean. The only thing that's out here are our color calibrators, right? So things are looking pretty good here. This is in shadow, so this makes sense, right? And if I were to move this here, things would behave correctly. So we can now, if we're feeling pretty good, let's go to our world settings. All right, so world settings. Now, if you don't have this panel open, remember you can go to settings, world settings right here. Or you can find that under edit, or maybe it's under window, the world settings right here. Okay. So these are pretty much the default settings here. The only thing that's been enabled is use ambient occlusion. Okay, now, if you're not sure what ambient occlusion is like a cavity map, all right? And it's going to bake a occlusion map where light is being occluded, okay? So if you take a look online and just look up, ambient occlusion map, you'll have a good idea of kind of how it's applied to our models. So again, think about it as cavity maps and bringing out detail within your environment, right? So just enable that for now. And here, the static light level, we're gonna leave this at 1 for this scene. Just be careful with this one, because as you drop this less than 1, it will, increase, it will lower the scale of the scene, and basically give the scene more photons to calculate per the scale of the scene. So as you drop this, it will slow down render times. Now, the ones that matter for the most part in our instance right now are going to be the number of indirect light bounces. All right. Now, right now it's set to 3. I would set this to maybe 10 for, kind of finalizing renders or bakes, and then set the number of light sky bounces to 4. Okay, now that's what I'm going to use for the final one, but that's not what I'm going to use right here in this workshop. Okay, and we want to make sure the number of indirect bounces, Unreal Engine says, like, it doesn't matter if you go over 10. There's a basically less return in render time. So you're not going to get, render times actually won't increase and the quality won't increase. So you don't want to set this thing to something insanely high. And the indirect light bounces, again, are if we zoom out and we take a look at our directional light, that we have here under main, it's going to be this light that kind of comes in, for example, and it's going to bounce in here, and it's going to bounce, you know, hit the floor and then bounce out through the scene, and it's going to bounce around 10 times, and it's going to do that for every single light that's in our scene. So as you can imagine, setting this to something incredibly large is, you're going to notice a big slowdown in render times or baking times. I will just set this to about 5 for right now, and then I will increase, if the default for skylight bounces is 1, I'll maybe bump this to 2 or 3 for the purposes of this workshop. All right. And now that we have that, we're going to do use ambient occlusion. And if we go down here, we can take a look at some other settings. Now, the important ones are, there's direct illumination occlusion, how much of the AO is applied to direct lighting. I typically leave that at the default, but how much of the occlusion is applied to indirect lighting. Sometimes if you don't want kind of this dirty, kind of this dirt occlusion effect, you can tone that down. So if you want, maybe set this to maybe something about 0.5 or so, because you have to keep in mind we're also going to be using screen space ambient occlusion, so we won't need that to darken our scene too much. Okay, and then we have occlusion exponent. The higher the exponent, the more contrast. So if we feel like, you know what, this scene, there's a bit too much contrast happening, let's tone that down, I would say I can drop that down to maybe about 0.6, 0.65. Now remember, all these have to do with this use ambient occlusion. If you disable this, all those settings are blanked out, okay, or disabled. So that's how you kind of keep that here. And then the max occlusion distance. If you feel like you're getting too much occlusion, then you can tighten this up a bit, and that's kind of the fall off here. So if you see here, remember we don't have screen space ambient occlusion enabled. If we feel like we're having too much occlusion, then you can tighten that a bit, maybe to 100 or 65 or 70 or something like that. Okay. What I recommend is, you know, to change these settings and to do bakes and to kind of see how they affect. But for at least for the purposes of the workshop, these are the core settings that I'm going to modify, right? And if I take a look now, we have the Lightmass importance volume on our entire environment. We have the Lightmass portal, which is bringing light in here. And then there's one other thing that I typically like to do in here, and that's to kind of bring in a little bit more light. Okay, so the Lightmass portal does a good job bringing light in, but what you're going to see for ArcViz is the use of area shadows and Rect Lights, not only from our directional light. What I mean is, if you go ahead over here and if you grab this Rect Light, okay, I'm going to drag that and drop it right here. Okay, and it's going to come in here, and this guy is going to be straight static. Rect lights or area lights are fairly expensive, so you want to be careful with that. All right, and I'm going to put it right inside the door. You'll see that if I put it outside, you know, we're going to get a little bit more of the shadows in here, and if you want that effect, you certainly can go for that, but I'm going to just put it right inside the window here. Okay, and then I'm going to increase the size of this here to, let's see, we have source width down here. So if we increase that a bit, maybe to, you know, 450-ish. So basically the width of the window and the height of, or the glass doors, and then the height, we can maybe do 128 or 200. Should give us what we want. All right, so we have this nice area light now that's going to be pushing light into our scene along with the Lightmass portal, and you want to make sure to enable this on your Rect Light, which is use area shadows for stationary lights. Now, like I said, we're not going to be using stationary. I'm going to be using this as a static light purely to get nicer shadows on our interiors. All right, now there's other settings in here. We can pretty much leave everything else as default. And you know, you can mess with the barn door angle. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can kind of see the angle here. So it's kind of funneling light in there. You know, you can kind of see it fully flat, or I can increase that, maybe increasing that by about maybe 20 or so, or I think 40 would be fine, because you get this nice fall off of shadows happening here. And the length is fine there. And then the temperature is what's going to matter the most. Remember what I said? We have really nice warm lighting on the interior, and we want nice cool lighting and light bouncing coming from the exterior. So you can play with this and, you know, maybe give this a little bit more cool lighting to kind of blend in with this warm lighting as it falls off from cool to warm on the entire on the interior of the scene. All right, so we have effects world, shadows, and we'll primarily be messing with those. And then I will switch this from candelas to lumens, and probably, now this is a subtle effect. I don't want to like blast the interior with an area light, right? That defeats the whole purpose. So instead, you know, I'll do, you know, keep it nice and subtle, you know, see what it does. But before I go any further, I would say now I would want to do a build here that's a little bit higher quality than what we've used before. So I would do a medium and then bake this lighting now to kind of see how things, you can maybe revert back to these settings just to get a good sense. I may do that actually just for the rect light. Maybe I'll add two. Yep. So we'll just keep this like so. And what I will go ahead and do is another build. Now this one, what they have been baking at so far has been about 1 to 2 minutes. This may be a little bit longer. So we'll kind of see how it does. We'll take a look at the swarm agent and kind of, see what happens. It also helps sometimes to like take screenshots of your scenes, so you can kind of compare the befores and afters to kind of see, because if you walk away or some things change dramatically or subtly, you want to make sure to track those changes. There we go. So map processing is about done, and you can see what's happening as we're making our way through and increasing the settings. So it's starting to soften these shadows, and when you go for a production build, you're gonna get nice softer shadows, right? So, and overall happy with this direction. So now what we can do is also take a look at the bottom, and it helps to understand where Unreal Engine saves this information. Actually, it might be under Lightmass, expand the settings here, and then there's light maps. So take a look at all of this. This is where Unreal Engine is storing all of this information, and you'll see grayscale maps, colored maps, almost like tangent maps. What are these, right? I thought we were just baking light maps. Well, don't forget that we're baking direct shadows, indirect shadows, and then also a shadow mask. Okay, so the shadow masks help us give us nicer details that are closer to the camera, and then as you move away, you can see that they get a little bit blurrier and smaller resolution. So same thing happens if I go here. You'll notice the same thing happen here. Now it's a little bit different for a terrain, but notice the texture popping. That's the shadow mask working. All right, now I don't want to increase the shadow resolution on the terrain because that will take much longer to bake. But I would say if we're happy with this result and we're happy with the overall lighting, we can finally move to bringing back our post-processing. Because remember, if everything starts to look good here, then once we add the post-processing, it's going to make it even look better. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. What we want to do now is go to our post-process volume. So we can see that we have it here on top. the key thing that you want to enable is at the bottom. You want to do enabled, obviously here, and then infinite extend. Otherwise, remember, this is kind of a volume based. So if I go ahead and put that, now we can see that it's applied to the entire level regardless of where you're at. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is let's bring back some of those settings that we disabled in our project settings. One being bloom. So we can go ahead and bring bloom back, so you can see I have intensity, and as I increase that, it kind of, you get that camera bloom that comes in on your objects, depending on the white. Now this is mostly a white environment, so everything kind of is flooding the camera with bloom. Now you could dial that back down by increasing the threshold, but you can leave that at 1 and then just lower the intensity here a bit. Now, if you're running on a high-end machine, I highly recommend that you use convolution. Convolution is, it says it right here, too expensive for games. So if you're doing game development, stay away from this. But if you're doing, using it for visualization, for ArcViz or automotive, then you definitely want to use that. And take a look at that nice highlight that's coming. And this is kind of that nice, almost that bokeh effect here on the sun. It goes from this kind of the standard one that's okay, it's there, to this convolution where it really works the way that you would expect in real life. The next one is we can go ahead and enable auto exposure. So now we can set auto exposure, and then we have compensation, and then we have min max EV. Okay, so what I typically do, remember here, we want to change this back to game settings. Okay, now if I do game settings, it's going to override this. So see what happens. Otherwise, we completely disable any auto exposure and it's going to use what's in this setting. So now that I've done that, you see that kind of darkens everything a little bit. And we have this exposure compensation, so we can increase that maybe to 1.5. So it's starting to brighten up the environment a little bit. When I say brighten up the environment, what exposure does is it's letting more light into the camera. So you have to be careful. If you're like, my scene's too dark, don't overcompensate your dark lighting by boosting the exposure, right? Exposure should just be there just to let the light that exists into the camera and into the sensor. So on the exterior, you typically, would use the max EV for the brightest areas. In this case, we can actually head pretty low. You can see if I head to 0, things get really bright. So we want to kind of increase that EV value to maybe between 2 and 4. So I'll leave this at 2 right now. Then if I go on the interior, watch what happens when we go on the interior. The interior is a lot darker, but look at what's happening. Because the minimum EV is set to such a low value, it's letting in way too much light into the sensor. So what I would do is just kind of drop this. So if I start at 0, it starts to darken. And we get that nice set of contrast in here. Then we can maybe go to something like maybe -2 or -1. And what you typically would want to do is go to the darkest point in your environment, which would be this back corner here, and you would light it, or not light it, but you would set your exposure value till it brings that level of light up. So if I set that to -2, you'll see, okay, that's looking okay, but I'll probably leave this at -1 because I want this corner to be dark. Okay, and then it doesn't, overblow anything too much over here. So things are starting to look good, and the sensor, the exposure is working really well. And we have these set up. All right. So we're going to keep moving down with our post-process volume here. So we have min max EV. So we're going to actually go to the next one, which is Chromatic Aberration. This one, just be careful about this one. What it does is it frays the edges. So I'll go ahead and kind of show you an extreme example. See that? It's almost like that old 3D effect, or that you would see on old screens, where it kind of, at the edges of your models, it separates the color based on the color spectrum. It's intense. Some people don't like it at all, or some people use it very subtly. So I would recommend using something very subtle if you use it at all. But it entirely depends on the look and feel that you're going for. If you're doing something that actually has a lot of chromatic aberration, or maybe something like a cyberpunk-esque type game, sci-fi game, you'd probably want a little bit more chromatic aberration. All right, not going to be using dirt mask or anything like that. And then we're going to leave these camera settings default. And then now we can add back some lens flares. Again, lens flares is one of those things. People either love it or hate it, but I'll at least show you how to make it. So, or modify it. So it would help probably to look at the sun here. And then I grab my post-processing volume and then I enable lens flare. And there you go. It starts to add it there, and it's based on whenever you really look at a really bright area, in this case, the sun. And if you don't have bloom turned on, so actually if I set this intensity, take a look, lens flare is just gone, right? So lens flare works in combination with bloom. So we'll keep that on. And if you want an increased intensity a bit, you certainly can. And you can mess with the bokeh size. Or bokeh size here, and play with different settings, including the threshold. So you can get something that's pretty intense. Maybe I'll set the threshold a little bit higher there. So if you wanted to lower that and have it more intense, you can. All right, and we're gonna depth of field. I really like to use, but I use those with cinematic cameras. So we'll leave that off on this, and then I'll show you how to create some cinematic cameras here shortly. So I'm going to actually set the lens flare back. Okay, so those are post-processing effects. Then we get into color grading. Okay, be careful of this. Okay, because again, don't use color grading until the very end. You want to light your scene like you would with no post-processing. Now we're like, okay, I got it. I know what I want. I want to change things creatively. So out here, notice how everything's nice and cool out here. Blue light, and we go inside, we have the nice warm interior artificial light. And man, oh man, look at that lens flare. That's pretty intense. So I'm going to actually dial that way down to like intensity of 1. And reduce that bokeh size, kind of the default values. So get something like that. And I would say I would even drop the intensity, maybe 0.2-ish. There we go. So it's there, and it makes it look like we're looking through a camera. All right. But back to this. If I wanted to just change the white balance of an entire image, and this is where the color grading helps with the color correction of the color calibrator, is I can grab this now and say, you know what, I want to now make things a little bit cooler and watch, or a little bit warmer. So as I go up, so the white balance works as an inverse of temperature. So as I increase this temperature, things get warmer. And then as I decrease it, things get cooler. So that's now our darks. Like our whites have a little bit of a white tint, or excuse me, our whites have a little bit of a blue tint, our chromes, materials, and everything. So you can have complete control over the final look and feel of things. Now, I lit this with the purpose of having a cool exterior and a warm interior. So I'll leave this kind of at that neutral type of lighting here. Maybe even 65. So leave it at that default, but you can play with that value. There's definitely, you can play with the tint as well, which is kind of like an HSV or a color shift. So you can get something completely stylized here by changing the color tint. But we'll leave that off for now. And then you have global settings. Okay, let's say, like I want to just boost and give this thing a little bit more color, and watch it. You can boost the saturation. You can increase the contrast a little bit. Now remember, contrast is going to darken your darks and lighten your lights. So if we go on the inside, where it's more applicable here. You can kind of see the before and after, and it does a nice job. Now the thing to keep in mind is that Unreal Engine already uses color grading. This is just letting you modify it a bit, okay? So if you look up this here, you've seen me pull this up during the workshop, but I highly recommend just constantly referring to the Unreal Engine documentation. But it uses the ACES, Academy Color Encoding System, Filmic Tone Mapper. Everything that we're using here is based off the new ACES tone mapper, okay? So, this also helps kind of explain a lot of different things when it comes to exposure, and we didn't change anything. This is it by default, by the way. All right, so there's that, and boost a little bit of contrast, a little bit of saturation, or you can go in the opposite direction. You can say, what, it's overly saturated. Let me give this, let me not mute it too much, but let's tone back and take back some of that color. Okay, you have gamma, gain, and offset, which work again for color correction. And if you go in here, you can see kind of, adjusting the gamma. Well, again, it's a display space type setting, or you can actually change it in just a certain value. So if, sometimes some games have that, or some of those movies have that kind of like greenish tone or warm tone, or, depending if it's a post-apocalyptic world or sci-fi world, you can adjust that all through here, through the gamma and offset and gain. But we'll keep these default here, and I'll leave the saturation at 1. Contrast is fine at 1. And then you can adjust, same thing if you wanted to change just the highlights or just the shadows to get some nicer effects here. I believe if we go to change some of these values, you'll see kind of subtle differences that's happening in the saturation or in the shadows within the environment. But I'll typically stay away from these settings here. Won't mess with any miscellaneous ones, but then you have this, which is the filmic curve. So if you look at online, there's what's called the filmic S curve, and this is basically what we use to adjust contrast. Okay, so here's the shoulder, because it's really, if you've never seen that before, none of this is going to make sense. Slope, toe, shoulder, back, what the heck does all that mean, right? So this is the linear section, and again, this filmic S curve just darkens your darks and lightens your lights, in essence, in its simplest form, right? So as you increase the shoulder or increase the toe, you'll change things accordingly, right? So if I go to the toe and start to increase, you'll start to see that the darks become darker, and if I go to the shoulder, you'll see that the lights become lighter. So you can definitely have those, adjust those. That takes a little bit of practice to get a good feel for it, but for the most part, you can mess with that and mess with contrast to kind of get some nicer, to boost that contrast within your scene. Okay, now finally we'll take a look at the rendering features, which in this case we turned off ambient occlusion in our settings, so let's turn that back on. So if I go ahead, boom, so we get these nice layer of ambient occlusion on top. And if you remember, if I go back to our Lightmass settings, I set the distance to 10, and then I set the occlusion exponent to 0.65, which is less than the default of 1. Okay. All right, so we're using baked ambient occlusion plus screen space ambient occlusion. All right, so don't go overboard on too much ambient occlusion in the bakes and then too much ambient occlusion in the post-process, because then your scene just, again, looks dirty, okay? So we'll, tighten this a bit, bring this radius in. Right now it's set to 200. Maybe I do 100 to kind of bring that in. And you can maybe set this at 0.6. Like 1 is way too dirty, so I'd keep it around 0.5, 0.6. Okay. We're not going to use any ray tracing features, so maybe we can do a workshop on that later. But you can see that you also have motion blur, and if we go here, you can adjust these to add some motion blur into your scene, and you can set like the max value here, or however much that you want to increase this. So we have that within our scene. You see if I'm kind of moving around, I can get some different effects. Okay, so we're back kind of here. So I like to look on the outside and inside. And we'll take a look at reflections, and specifically screen space reflections. This is really nice once you have all your nice reflections baked properly. And then if you go and just reset this back and turn that back on, now we're getting the reflections back within our scene, right? And so you'll see that sampling happening. So if I go to the post-process volume here, excuse me. I'll go to the post-process volume here, and you can increase the quality. I would just be careful about that. You can lower it if you want, or increase it to something like 100 just to get some better results, but it's pretty safe to just keep it at the default value. You can also adjust it where you lower the max roughness or increase it. So if I increase the max roughness, what that does is objects that aren't shiny will be impacted by screen space occlusion, which we don't want. So we'll just keep it at 0.6, or maybe even lower if you want more objects to be impacted by that. But you'll see now our water is starting to get some really nice screen space reflections appearing in it, in combination with our base reflections that we created, which was the planar reflections for the pool, as well as the spherical reflections. All of those are affecting and impacting our environment and working together to have something that looks really, really good. Okay, and everything else is set there. And there are ways, right? I can show you, maybe Unreal Engine has this nice way to do custom effects here. So if I go to actually duplicate this post-processing volume, and I'll call this pool. Now we can apply shader effects to the post-processing volume. So if I go ahead and make this and position this here, and I duplicate it, so it's going to have all the same settings, which I may or may not want. But what I can do is go to post-process material and add a custom shader effect, okay? And if I, let's say, go to the top view here, position that accordingly, and increase the size of this. We have it kind of roughly the size of the pool, so maybe 1400, and then the Y here, I'll set this to 500, and then back to perspective. Oh yeah, that's about as tall as the pool, so we can do that. All right, so obviously right now if we go into the pool, nothing happens, right? But I can apply this shader effect that already exists on this water and apply it as a post-processing effect. And I can do that by going to post-process volume. Oops, sorry, I lost my place here. And we want to go to post-process material. So we want to add an array element. And then we want to choose and then do an asset reference and refer to the material that has the post-processing. So now I can go ahead and hit this drop down, and it already exists in the project. I won't be making it in this workshop or anything, but here it is, advanced effects underwater. So you go ahead and do that. Now you need to make sure that you do set this to be not infinite extends and have it just specifically be on the volume. So now that we've done that, I can do this where I go underwater and look at that. It looks like we're actually underwater. So this is a nice effect that you can apply. In this instance, I would definitely, disable ambient occlusion here and whatnot. But I think all in all, this looks good. Okay. Take a look. You can also hit G to disable the gizmos, because you may be like, well, we set a light here, I can't see the light. Well, it's here, right? This object has, now that we've enabled bloom, has a material with an emissive property. So if you're interested in that, so I mean, we can basically grab here where I can go to like basic and I can do a like drop a sphere in here. And I can set this to, just a nice small sphere. And what I want to do is just go to my materials one here. And you can see that I have a fundamentals material that can give us a nice glowing effect. And you can see there. So this has an emissive value, and then any object with, that we want to be kind of self-illuminated, now that we have post-processing, we certainly can do that here. If I go down, remember, if I disable it, it goes back to what it was before. What it was before without post-processing. So kind of take a look at everything as a whole, right? We're looking at this interior scene and we hit enabled, and that's our interior now. So I can grab this and we can go on the exterior and take a look at our exterior. And now if we feel like we've made good use out of our color calibrators, we can also disable those or hide those or delete them, whichever one that you want to do. Actually, they'll show back up in game mode, but now we can kind of explore the game level. We can see a nice the motion blur that's being applied. We can see the lens flares, the blooms, the color correction happening. I mean, look at that nice convolution lens flare combination happening because of this the post-processing, right? We kind of go over here into the corner. We have still, everything's looking nice and dark still on this back corner. Then we go out, we have a nice brightly lit high noonday, and then we come out here and everything is still, it's not overexposed, it's not too bright. So we're able to use auto exposure to go between these two scenes without having any harsh transitions. And then we can go out and explore the rest of the terrain. Okay. One thing to keep in mind too. Now that wraps up the post-processing, the light baking, and everything for this video and for this module. But what I wanted to make sure to show you is to have an understanding of how the light maps and light baking works. Okay. So for example, you just kind of see, we just primarily did the lighting and the reflections and the post-processing. There's a whole workflow that has to happen to prepare your models. Okay. What do I mean by that? If I go in here now, and let's say you bake this out at high quality settings, and your couch, you're just like, oh gosh, it's not, I still get artifacts. It's still looking rough. What can I do to specifically help this prop? Now, I already ran tests and stuff like that. Once you set this to production, everything bakes out well. Okay, but let's pretend, right? So if I grab this couch, we want to find this static mesh, okay? And the mesh itself is static, but there's a little bit more that needs to happen than just saying static, boom. double click this and let's look at the model settings for this. All right. The key thing that you need for your meshes are what's called light map UVs. All right. So if you've never, or if you haven't prepared or you primarily get assets from 3D artists, they should prepare and have a primary UV channel and then prepare secondary light map UVs. That can be UV channel 0, UV channel 1, so those are 2, or in Maya, or that's in Max. In Maya, it's UV set 1, UV set 2, or map 1, map 2. All right. So we can take a look and see kind of what we have here. And what we have here is, one, we have LOD settings. The LOD tools in Unreal are actually fantastic. We can maybe talk about that in another workshop of, just asset preparation. But what I want to specifically look at is this here. If I expand this and we look at the settings for the UV map channel. Actually, it's under here. It's under LOD, but it's under build settings here. Look at the minimum light map resolution. It's 64. 64 what? 64 pixels. So 64 by 64 pixels, a nice square image or whatever. If I go here, I look at UV channel 0. Nice clean UVs for UV map 0. And then I go here to UV channel 1. And then what Unreal Engine is doing is take, or what the 3D artist did was take those and then take those UVs and apply those to the second UV channel. Now, some objects aren't that clean, right? So if I grab actually this, the exterior house and open that up, and let's take a look at this. I can look at this here, and we can look at the UVs. Look at UV channel 0. It's red, and it's way out of bounds. UV channel. The good thing is, or what we need to understand about 3D models and 3D art is that having a UV channel 1 with very large UVs, or UVs that go outside the bounds of the 1-to-1 UV space, is fine as long as you have this, where your secondary UV channel has everything packed in 1-to-1. Because what Unreal Engine is doing, it's taking those UV maps and packing them here. If I go down to light maps, again, that's what this is. Light map texture, shadow map texture. You can double click these, open these. It's gonna look like a jumbled mess, right? But what this is these are all the models just packed up and what's called atlased into these larger texture maps. So even if you have a 64 by 64, which is small, it's basically just puzzle pieces in a larger map that is 2048 by 2048. Okay, so there's that. Now, I was saying, what if you still have artifacts, right? And if we have a key prop, right, or maybe you have a character, maybe not a character, because characters are going to be, based on dynamic lighting, but a hero prop that's statically lit in your scene. Okay, well, you can go here to your couch and say minimum light map resolution, set that to 256. So you go from 64 to 64, right? And then, or 64 to 128 to 258, right? So we're multiplying it by 2 multiple times. So powers of 2, okay? So we've given ourselves significantly more resolution to bake this couch out, all right? So the other thing is you can use generate light map UVs. So Unreal Engine can calculate those. And I used to not touch that, but man, Unreal Engine does a good job. And I kind of stay away from telling people to use that. Okay, like it's a nice thing to use, but don't rely on it. Because if you give assets that are supposed to have light map UVs and you tell somebody, just use Unreal Engine, it's gonna be like, what the hell, right? So make sure to take care of your assets based on whatever specification. If they're like, no, just make sure UV map channel 1's good, we'll take care of it with the material and tiling, and then we'll have Unreal Engine pack it, that's fine. So it all depends on your workflow. Okay, so we can set that to 256, and I'll set this back so it'll pull back the original UVs. And then what you can do is, there are other settings in here. I typically don't use that unless I'm doing like very complex models, like vehicle models. So I leave these, but a lot of times you'll actually use full precision UVs and high precision tangents. But again, you don't want to use those for just kind of basic environment stuff. Great, yeah. So you can boost that, and that will give you some nice UVs, and you can see under here, you can see that it changes the light map resolution on the general settings. Now there's another area that you can do this specifically, which is one, you can actually select this object here right within the outliner, the world outliner, and then you can go down. So under static mesh, I have to remember where that is. No, it's not here. If you scroll down, there it is. Under the lighting tab, you can override the light map resolution. Okay, and then you can see that it's using, if it's grayed out, Unreal Engine's using 1024. Now, Unreal Engine is pretty smart. It's not going to take your entire building and say, you're going to get 32 pixels by 32 pixels. No, it's using the scale of the object with the scale of the environment, and looking at what's called texel density. So not pixel density, texel density, right? So just keep in mind that for larger objects, it'll use larger values, so you don't have to change that yourself. Unreal is pretty intelligent about that. Versus something like a vase sitting on a table, it's going to use 64. If you wanted to boost that, you can do that right here, or you can go up here to the top and do under lighting info, and then do light map resolution adjustments. And then you can globally change this for the entire scene. Meaning that the smallest object will have maybe 64 pixels by 64, and the largest objects will have 512 or 1024. Just be careful about using those values. Don't crank those up super high, because you will inflate the app size, the game size, with more maps. So it's not free. There's a cost, and that's texture memory, right? Okay, and so that covers kind of just like understanding how Unreal Engine, Lightmass, UVs, and light maps all kind of work together. And remember, you can go into different view modes and look at lighting only, which is just the lighting information. And we can see how that area light in combination, so the directional light, area light, or the rect light, and the portal light are bringing in nice color, right? Cool, nice color here, and then eventually transitions to nice warm lighting there. We have detail lighting, which gives you a little bit more information. It does give you more reflections, but turns everything grayscale. And then you could go into this mode, which is reflections mode, which basically turns everything to this kind of like trippy chrome world. But you have that as a view. And then remember, we have player collision. And here, again, you can look at light map density, okay? So this is actually pretty telling, okay? Because this light map density, green and blue, right? Anything green and blue means, hey, look at these squares. This is texel density, okay? And it's good. But what Unreal is saying, hey, on this inside, if you select this mesh here, okay, the inside of this house is set to 2048. That's really high, right? And Unreal is saying, dude, that's way too much. That's way too much. Lower that. It'll still bake it out. But what this light map density means is you're using way more pixels and texels than is viewable on the screen, right? So it wants you to kind of tone that down using this these different view modes here under optimization view mode. So there's light map complexity, and then light map density. Density just means, hey, anything that's red means it's too large. Like UV light maps are too large, which again we can confirm by seeing that this is actually set to 2048, which is pretty high. All right, then you have light map or optimization view modes. Light map complexity, and blues is fine. Unreal Engine's not sweating when it comes to anything lighting wise, but we can see that multiple stationary lights, it starts to get a little bit green, and even in some areas a little bit orange or red. But for the most part, if we look around our scene, I mean, we're in pretty good shape. There's nothing that's too expensive here. And we look out and everything's good. And then we can probably just keep it on those ones right now. Because the one thing that I want to finish off with is the stat or command line. So if you hit the tilde key, which is the key right next to the number one. So you hit tilde, look at that. It pops open this command line. So it says enter command. So you can type in stat space FPS and hit enter, and look at that. So we can see the FPS here. And if I go into play mode, all right, I'm running in RTX 2080 and I'm running about 20-30 milliseconds, and I'm ranging between 40-50 frames. It kind of drops in some areas, right? So this is definitely not, you know, a super light scene, but we're able to still, it looks like, maintain well over, for the most part, 60 frames per second at any given time. Okay, there's also tilde key, so pop open the command, and then unit, stat unit. Then you have this one, which is a little bit more information, so combines the stat FPS and the stat unit. So now you see how much time it's spending on per frame, any game specific things that are happening or executions, and how long it takes to draw or draw calls and batches, and it gives you just a little bit more information for profiling. Okay, so I will save this out, and if I were to do final bake settings, I would go to my world settings here, and I'd bump this up. I'd leave the scale level to 1. I'd set this to 10 indirect bounces. I'd set it to 5 sky indirect bounces, and that'll probably be the main settings that I changed, and everything else should be fine. So 10 or maybe 4 is fine here, and then I actually don't compress the light maps, so there's less artifacting. If you're working on a game, I would recommend actually keeping that compressed to help with game size. And then we talked about these settings here. Yeah, so those are what I would do to kind of kick off a final build, and then I would change this to production. And then to kind of get a good sense of what everything looks as a final, you can go to settings here and engine scalability, and you can see that it's set to cinematic. So you could maybe set this to high or epic or cinematic, depending on your hardware. If you're going for high-end visuals, just the highest possible on a high-end machine, and you want to output some nice images, definitely stick with cinematic. All right, and I have the final scene here that already has, I'll save these. And this is the final bake here. Okay, and we can kind of see how things look. And we can see how clean. So remember what I was talking about with the lighting? Notice how we get nice soft shadows. And I think this took about 30 or 40 minutes to bake out on the high-end workstation I'm on. So, but again, all in all, everything looks good. There's minimal artifacting. and I'm happy with how things turned out. So if you wanted to finalize the bakes, I would just bake it at the end of the workshop. Walk away once you're done or something like that, or if you go for dinner or something, and you'll be good to go. So I would say that concludes the workshop and all the key concepts we wanted to cover today. So to kind of recap, we covered just very high level intro to the Unreal Engine interface. We covered how to set up exterior lighting, how to set up interior lighting, how to bake lighting, set up reflections, post-processing, and put it all together and make it look good, make it look creatively appealing. So hopefully you guys were able to grasp all that. Like I said, I'll edit these videos together at the end, and make sure to also share that with people. So now's the end part of the workshop, where the remainder, the last 30 minutes, is just used to continue to answer any questions, and I can you guys can work and ask me questions as you're working till for the next 30 minutes, so till 4 o'clock. So thanks, guys. I mean, I'm not going nowhere, but just wanted to say thanks.
Yeah, thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
That was good. Thank you so much. So if anybody has any questions, or there's anything else you'd like to explore while we have the time.
All right, that concludes the recording for this specific module. Be sure to check out the rest of the modules down below in the description. And if you found this helpful, please let me know down below. And definitely plan to put out more Unreal Engine and Unity and real-time 3D content here in the near future. So thanks and take care, everyone.